Balance of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Tyler Kendall, I'm Joe Matthew.
Tonight, the clock ticks on potential U.S. military strikes against Iran.
It looked like I'm right about the material that they've gathered already. It's a tremendous amount of material. And I think within a matter of weeks, or certainly within a matter of months, they're going to be able to have a nuclear weapon. We can't let that happen.
One day after the president laid a timeline for his decision on whether or not to intervene militarily, more missiles are fired into Iran, hitting several points, causing injuries. As Iran's foreign minister warns against any diplomatic talks, what we can expect next as European ministers try to cool down the war.
Plus, the disruption to the U.S. workforce now being felt as the administration's ICE raids take hold in cities across the country. The economic fallout and the hundreds of billions on the line.
Also tonight, reports the Trump administration may revoke waivers for allies with chip plants in China, a prospect that impacted markets and threatened to dramatically escalate trade tensions.
And we're now T-minus 2 weeks until that self-imposed July 4th deadline for Congress to pass the president's long-promised tax bill. But with key sticking points remaining, how realistic is that deadline and where do lawmakers go from here?
Thanks for being with us this evening. We start tonight with tensions in the Middle East. The White House says it will hold off any attacks on Iran for 2 weeks to give diplomacy a chance. That process underway today in Geneva, where Iran's foreign minister discussed de-escalation with his counterparts from France, Germany, and the UK. Here's British Foreign Secretary David Lammy, as well as comments made by President Trump after those talks concluded.
We are keen to continue ongoing discussions and negotiations with Iran, and we urge Iran to continue their talks with the United States. This is a perilous moment, and it is hugely important that we don't see regional escalation of this conflict.
Iran doesn't want to speak to Europe. They want to speak to us. Europe is not going to be able to help in this one.
This is where we start with Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson with us live in Washington. Wendy, you just heard the two sides of this story. Does Donald Trump even care what comes from these meetings with European leaders?
He sure didn't seem like it. He completely dismissed out of hand that these talks will get anywhere. He said that he doesn't believe the Europeans are capable of reaching a deal with Iran. I mean, it is hard when you're not the primary party to not be at the table. Yeah. But Donald Trump has gone back and forth in that same group, chat with reporters there about what it is he wants to do. He laid out the 2-week plan, which yesterday when he said it sounded like this sort of verbal tick that he's had throughout his presidency, which is when he means later, he says 2 weeks. Check back in 2 weeks. He did that with the health care bill, with an infrastructure bill, with lots of things over the 2 weeks, even Russia-Ukraine talks. But today, he said, I think 2 weeks would be the maximum. So basically, I think everyone should be on alert that if he decides to go in militarily, it could be at any time. And yet, he also is trying to get his own talks started with Iran. But at this point, Iranians in the streets are burning both American flags and Israeli flags. And I think it was the foreign minister at Grachi said today that America is a partner in crime with Iran. So we're now in it, whether the U.S. is in it or not, whether it strikes militarily or not, we're seen as part of the fight.
Well, Wendy, you're talking about the shift in rhetoric that we really have seen in these past few days. Our own reporting actually indicates that Senator Lindsey Graham, of course, the Republican from South Carolina, a more hawkish voice on this, had been advising the president in recent days, taking phone calls with him. Do we have any sort of clarity on who is advising the president going forward here as he weighs this decision?
Well, in addition to Lindsey Graham, who, as you said correctly, Tyler, is quite hawkish militarily, you also had Steve Bannon at the White House yesterday, I believe it was. And Steve Bannon is leading the sort of MAGA charge against intervention. They are reminding Trump of his America First policy.
Is that what changed his mind?
And it could change his mind. We don't know. We don't know who was the last person he spoke to and where he really stands on this. I mean, going in militarily is tremendously fraught. And if he is, he could argue that increasing the chances of a terror attack on U.S. soil, which bombing Iran would make happen, likely, or increase the chances of, that doesn't protect America first either. So I think he's obviously talking to a lot of people and trying to weigh what happens, but clarity is not something we have today.
All right, Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson, thank you so much. And joining us now is Ken Pollack. He served on the National Security Council as Director for Persian Gulf Affairs and is a former Persian Gulf military analyst for the CIA. He's now the Vice President for Policy at the Middle East Institute. Ken, thanks so much for joining Bloomberg TV and radio. I'd love to get your thoughts on the decision-making process here. Can you just put into context for us, what are the factors the U.S. is going to be weighing, as President Trump says 2 weeks is now the maximum for his decision?
Wow, Tyler. So I could tell you what I think Donald Trump is weighing, and I could tell you what I think the U.S. should be weighing. I'm not sure that those are the same things, though. For President Trump, a lot of this is personal. He made offers to the Iranians. The Iranians rejected those offers, or at least they had up until Israel bombed. He's obviously got his domestic constituents. And of course, as you guys have pointed out, he's got a split constituency. He's got a group of traditional conservative internationalists who very much want to join the war, who do not want to see Iran acquire nuclear weapons and want to do everything to prevent it. He's also got his MAGA base, which include a lot of neo-isolationists who are not interested in Iran, anything going on there. Israel, for that matter, they're opposing him just as fiercely. And I think for the president, there's a big set of question marks as to what are the risks of long-term American engagement? Will the U.S. be sucked into a long-term war? As when he pointed out, he promised no forever wars. On the other hand, he clearly would like to get a deal. I think that if he can't get a deal, he'd certainly like to be the president who ended the Iranian nuclear threat forever. So I think he's got a whole host of different considerations there in his own mind. And I think that's why he hasn't made a decision yet, and why we've seen him swing back and forth. At one point, seemed more likely to go, now maybe less so, now weighing it.
Yeah, it does feel like we're in a slightly different world than we were even on Wednesday when we last talked about this. Ken, there's a lot of talk today about the day after, and this is what Steve Bannon and others are urging the president to consider. What do you think? If the United States chose to strike Fordo or other sites with a couple of B-2 bombers, this isolated strike as it's been characterized, what would Iran be compelled to do in return?
But look, this is a very big question. On the one hand, the Iranians have invested a tremendous amount into this nuclear program. It's very important to the regime. Its destruction is going to be a very painful pill for them to swallow. And they probably fear that it's the kind of thing that could undermine the stability of the regime. On the other hand, Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, has demonstrated time and again over the decades that he is incredibly respectful of American military power, and that ultimately, he's not a nice man, I don't particularly care for him, but he is both prudent and he is a strategic thinker. We have seen him more or less rein in his horns, take his licks, go back to the drawing board when he realized that he was overmatched. Your viewers may remember 2020, President Trump killed the number 2 man in Iran, Qasem Soleimani, the head of their Quds force. So the second most, and the Iranian response was minimal.
Right. So to build off of this, our analysts at Bloomberg say that if the Fordo nuclear site and other nuclear facilities were hit, it would likely serve a devastating blow, but it wouldn't end Iran's nuclear program. Can you put into context here, do we risk Iran doubling down on efforts moving forward?
Yes, I think this is the most important question, Tyler. I really hope that this is the foremost issue that President Trump thinks about, that it's not enough to simply destroy the Iranian program now. The really important issue is making sure that Iran doesn't rebuild its nuclear program and just try to get nuclear weapons as fast as it can. Right? And that means whatever the United States does has to be designed to do that. The Fordo facility is important, but the real issue is that at the end of the day, no one is going to be able to take the knowledge of how to build nuclear weapons away. Neither we nor the Israelis are going to be able to kill the knowledge of how to make a nuclear weapon out of the heads of many, many Iranian scientists. And we should understand, The Iranians right now have about 300 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. That does not seem to have been destroyed. That's enough for about 10 nuclear weapons. Plus, they've got huge amounts of uranium feedstock. They have centrifuges that are unaccounted for. Even if we were to bomb Fordo, there's a bunch of centrifuges that we don't know where they are that could be used to enrich that uranium. And what's more, centrifuges aren't that hard to build, and the Iranians now know how to do it. So this is the great problem moving forward, is it's not enough to simply destroy what Iran has now. Whatever happens at the end of this war, whether it's Israel alone or Israel and the U.S. or Israel, the U.S. and our allies, we have to make sure that Iran will not, has no interest in, is deterred from rebuilding its nuclear program.
Okay, so let's consider what could be done then in the next 2 weeks, Ken. The president was asked about this, President Trump today, about the prospect of striking Iran and what might happen in the meantime. Here's what he said.
I'm not going to talk about ground forces. The last thing you want to do is ground forces.
Does Iran have 2 weeks, or could you strike before that? Are you essentially giving them a 2-week timeline?
I'm giving them a period of time. We're going to see what that period of time is, but I'm giving them a period of time, and I would say 2 weeks would be the maximum.
He says he doesn't want to even talk about ground forces, Ken, but Israel is talking about ground forces. To what extent does this additional time allow Benjamin Netanyahu to put special forces on the ground in Iran, potentially knock out Fordo without B-2 bombers, and do even more damage that would keep the United States from having to intervene offensively? Is that possible in your view?
Oh, absolutely. And look, I hope that actually is what happens. I think that's in many ways a better outcome. Even if the United States decides to enter the war after that, that would be a better way to do it. Then the United States could, again, focus on that long-term goal of preventing Iran from reconstituting, and the threat of U.S. force could be helpful to that. But, you're making a really important point, Joe, which is that the Israelis would not have started this if they did not have a plan for how to deal with Fordo without having B-2 bombers and GBU-57 bunker busters, MOPS, the massive ordnance penetrators, right? They've been looking at Fordo for 16 years. They are brilliant at coming up with plans. We've seen them with the beepers in Lebanon, with the drone base outside of Tehran here in Iran, right? These guys are not dumb, and they would not have gone into this if they did not have some kind of a plausible plan. May not be 100% certain. They may prefer that we do it, but there's no question in my mind that they have a plan in mind that they could execute to try to take down Fordo. And I actually think it would be much better for the United States, for the Israelis, for everyone, if the Israelis were the ones to try it first, and then only if it failed, that the United States then make a decision, do we need to come in and take out this facility and take on the responsibility for the wider war?
All right, so much to follow here. Ken Pollack, Vice President for Policy at the Middle East Institute. We thank you for your insights. Coming up, the potential economic impacts of the president's immigration policies to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. But next, we're exactly 2 weeks away from Congress's self-imposed tax bill deadline. The state of play when Rohit Kumar joins up ahead. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
A lot will be pulled out of this bill, like it always is in every reconciliation package that has happened over the last 20 years.
How predictable is that typically?
It is not predictable.
Okay.
It is not predictable because there are a lot of performative acts going in, a lot of bravado of what the policymaker or those that oppose the policy think is the right outcome, which is obviously their perspective, not anything connected with the rules. It's their whims, their wishes.
That was former Republican Congressman and Bloomberg contributor Patrick McHenry. He also held the Speaker's gavel for a short time before. He was on the early edition of Balance of Power. He's watched the Senate Parliamentarian comb through a budget bill before, a process that could risk some GOP priorities. For more, we're joined now by Bloomberg's Erik Wasson. Erik, we're already starting to hear from the Senate Parliamentarian about what can and can't stay in this bill. These are provisions Republicans wanted, but might not meet those guidelines of the reconciliation process. Can you just take us through what is on the chopping block here?
readers, there was a ruling very late last night that the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, will not be defunded in this bill. The parliamentarian has said that that's not a primarily budgetary move. It's a policy move that would require 60 votes in the Senate. Also, there was an attempt to slash the pay of the Federal Reserve staff to equalize it with Treasury employee pay. That was also slashed, as well as some EPA emission standards. So those are already gone. The big one that we're looking for, Sunday or Monday is Section 899. This is the revenge tax that would be imposed on companies domiciled in countries with quote unquote unfair taxes. This could really end up hurting a lot of multinationals, and they're saying that they may curtail investment in the U.S. Even though it doesn't directly affect Treasury bill interest, it could deter that as well. This could be stricken by the parliamentarian. This could be seen as a foreign relations provision, not primarily intended to raise revenue. So that's something we're very keenly looking at. There are also pieces of the Medicaid reform. There's an attempt there to stop Medicaid benefits for undocumented immigrants by pressuring states. That could be viewed as immigration policy rather than revenue, and stricken as well. Those are going to be the top ones I'm going to be looking for Sunday and Monday.
Well, assuming we get through the bird bath here early next week, Erik, there's a thought that this gets to a vote midweek, Wednesday. Is that realistic? Is that going to happen?
I think it's a bit of a stretch, but they've said they'll stay in during the 4th of July recess, which is scheduled to take place starting Thursday. I think we're going to be into the weekend. I'm prepared to work next weekend to see how this is all going to unfold. But there's really a real push to get it done by July 4th. They've set this deadline, and once that slips, then we could really slip into late July or August when the real deadline of needing to raise the debt ceiling, this bill would raise it by $5 trillion, starts to take place. The Treasury is running out of its accounting moves to avoid a payment default around then.
So don't make plans for next weekend, is what you're telling us. Bloomberg's Erik Wasson. Thank you, Erik. As we follow the bouncing ball on Capitol Hill, we bring in Rohit Kumar, co-leader of the National Tax Office, former Deputy Chief of Staff for former Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, where he worked directly with the parliamentarian in Senate procedures. Rohit, it's great to have you with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm curious your thought on the bird bath, specifically to the foundational accounting method that this whole bill is written on, the current policy baseline. Without it, it could be back to the drawing board. Will the parliamentarian okay the way this was written with regard to adding to deficit spending in extending the Trump tax cuts?
Well, I think two things are important here. In the what I think is unlikely event that somehow the current policy baseline is ruled not to be in compliance with Senate procedure, it is not necessarily back to the drawing board. It just means we have to go back to sunsetting the provisions as was done in 2017 at probably 8 years out, so that all the revenue loss happens within the 10-year window. The current policy baseline is mostly, really exclusively about allowing these tax cuts to be made permanent, consistent with the Senate rules. But in terms of what happens over the next 7, 8, 9 years, it actually probably doesn't make that big of a difference. Now, that said, as I sort of foreshadowed, I am skeptical that the current policy baseline as a concept is going to fall out because, at least as I read the statutes, it is the decision about which baseline to use is one that is vested with the chairman or chairperson, but in this case, chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, Lindsey Graham. And indeed, the Senate budget resolution, which passed, contemplates the current policy baseline. So to the extent that there were going to be issues where the Democrats wanted to challenge it, I think that would have been the time for it to happen. But for that challenge to happen now and to be successful, I think is exceptionally unlikely.
Well, Rohit, you know that part of the way that Republicans are trying to find cost savings are changes to Medicaid. And actually, the Senate plan goes a little bit farther. It tightens those work requirements, also lowers the Medicaid provider tax, which, as you know, would mean less federal matching funds. I'm wondering where you see this part of the package going from here, since it is such a politically fraught issue. Is the Senate going to have to make some compromises between what they're looking at versus the House version?
Oh, for sure. The name of the game on all of these things, whether it's Medicaid or taxes or anything in between, is compromise. And here it seems like, if you listen to Senator Hawley or Senator Collins or those that are expressing concern, it's really about rural health care and what consequence these changes might have for rural health providers. And so there's conversations about some sort of stabilization fund to address those issues. But look, this is a problem that is where solutions are available. as much as anything, this becomes sort of a, if there is the political will to get there, they will find a way. And I suspect at the end of the day they will, because remember, at the end of the day, this is not just about the Medicaid changes. It's not just about the immigration enforcement dollars or the defense spending. It's also about preventing the automatic tax increase on every W-2 wage earner in the country. Oh, and not for nothing, also avoiding default on our debt. So there is a lot riding on this, and it is hard to say that any one provision is so significant that it could risk taking the entirety of the thing down. Certainly people will say that, and it's understandable because they're in the middle of a negotiation, so they have to be able to say, do this or else. But at the end of the day, I am skeptical that they won't be able to find a way through this.
Well, this isn't the last leg here, even if this is a raving success in the next week or so, Rohit. The House isn't happy with a number of the changes that have been made, and they still need to deal with the matter of SALT. Whenever we talk to a Republican lawmaker from New York, they say not a penny less. And Donald Trump can't put up a MAGA candidate to primary them. They have, as it turns out, a pretty remarkable amount of leverage. Does that come out in a conference committee, or how is that finally handled in the end?
So I don't think that they're going to a formal conference in the sort of Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes a law sense of things. Okay. I think there's actually an ongoing effort already, and that will continue through next week to find a compromise number on the individual SALT cap. And I think there are sort of two levers here, one of which is getting a lot of attention, and that is, what is the overall amount of the cap? Is it 10,000? Is it 40,000? Those are the opening bids from each side, or is it somewhere in between? And then the other thing that's in play here is the Senate took a different approach on these sort of pass-through entity taxes that allows partnerships and S-corps and other pass-throughs to deduct their sort of business income taxes that end up showing up on their individual returns, because that's the way pass-throughs work. I could see some flex in the joints there. The way that the Senate does it, it takes away basically half the benefit from all pass-throughs, not just service providers, but all pass-throughs across the board. And I would be surprised if the New York SALT Caucus Republicans don't at some point make that a part of the negotiation. And that's where perhaps the deal gets done. Optically, maybe the number is less than 40,000, but there's this other fairly important provision that gets resolved favorably in from their perspective of the world. And that's how deals ultimately get done.
Rohit, we have just less than a minute, but I'd love to get your take. What are your odds right now that this is going to meet that rather ambitious timeline, or is it ambitious, of July 4th?
Look, it looks increasingly like the Senate is on track to take this bill across the Senate floor by, let's call it, the end of next week, or perhaps a little bit into the weekend. I am loath to predict whether the version that the Senate passes could ultimately pass the House without further amendment, because we don't know what that thing looks like yet. But I will say this. I would expect the president to insist that the House take it up forthwith. I think it would make political sense for the president to do so. Big compromise bills are not like fine wines. They do not get better with age. And so, I think there is at least a chance, perhaps call it a 50-50 chance, that they can run this thing through. And this may be the one time, at least in my professional experience, where Congress turns its homework in early. The deadline for this is not July 4th. That's a political deadline. The deadline is, let's call it the end of July, early August, as we get closer to the debt limit. But there is a lot of momentum behind this bill right now. Momentum doesn't last forever, and they would be right to try to harness it to get it across the finish line as quickly as possible.
Unheard of. What's next? Regular order? Rohit, Kumar, it's great to see you. National Tax Office co-leader, PwC. It's great to have you back, Rohit. Coming up, the fear gripping foreign-born workers in the U.S. as the uptick of ICE raids have a very real impact on work sites around the country. We'll have much more ahead. Alongside Tyler Kendall, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
As for the specific concerns regarding jobs, look, the president has made it very clear we need to remove public safety threats from the interior of our country, and that remains the focus and the priority of this administration when it comes to deportations, no matter where somebody works.
White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt answering reporters' questions when asked about the president's immigration policies, the impact they're having on the U.S. economy. Now exactly 5 months since Inauguration Day, we're getting a clearer picture of that impact. With ICE raids kicking into high gear of late, our team here at Bloomberg News reporting on the effects on the U.S. labor force. with employees, quote, terrified of ICE raids, now failing to show up at work, with $275 billion in economic output now at risk of being wiped out in California as the president seeks to fulfill his campaign pledge to undertake the largest deportation operation in history. Here with more is Rebecca Shee, the founding executive director of the American Business Immigration Coalition. Rebecca, it's great to have you with us. What's putting more stress on the job market, the actual deportations themselves or the fear that they're instilling in other workers?
Yeah, I'm glad to be here because just a few moments ago, the president getting off a plane in New Jersey said, look, I'm hearing from our farmers and our ranchers and the fear in the community. So just a few moments ago, the president actually said, I'm going to allow a process in which the employer, the farmer, can sponsor a work permit for their long-term undocumented employees, because this isn't just a workforce issue. This is a food security issue. We need the individuals that are doing the hard work. And like the president have said, have been here, many of them for 20, 25 years, and just not having the right documentation. And the president a few minutes ago just said, hey, let's look for a way in which the employer can sponsor them for their legal work permit. So we're very excited about that.
Well, Rebecca, we know that the U.S. workforce actually shrunk in May, partly because of a decline in foreign-born workers. Can you give us a little bit of insight into which industries that you are closely watching that are already feeling the ramification of these immigration policies?
Yeah, the undocumented workforce makes up only about 4% of the American workforce. But for certain industries, if you look at agriculture, hospitality, construction, healthcare, they make up between 20 up to 70% of those critical industries. And, those are major industries. That's our housing, food costs. That's the cost of our healthcare. And so to be able to have a process in which employers could sponsor a legal work permit for these long-term undocumented and contributing workers is the solution. And we're really glad that, the president, as he said a few moments ago, that that's the direction we need to be headed. Not blanket removal of everyone. That's going to crater these industries and harm our economy.
All right, let's hear it. You've referred to the president's comments today a couple of times. Rebecca, let's hear what President Trump said a short time ago when he was asked about this.
I love them, and I'm never going to do anything to hurt our farmers. And you could also say the leisure business, etc. There are some businesses where you have a disproportionate amount of people that are the people that you're talking about. At the same time, we have to get the criminals out of our country. And we're looking at doing something where, in the case of good, reputable farmers, they can take responsibility for the people that they hire and let them have responsibility, because we can't put the farms out of business.
So there you have it, to your point, Rebecca. But the president also is touting a ruling from a federal appeals court that allows him to retain control of the National Guard in California, where, of course, some immigration protests were taking place. And he suggests this big win, as he calls it, means that other such deployments will be allowed in other cities around the country. What will that mean if we start seeing troops on the streets of Chicago, of New York, of Philadelphia, when it comes to immigrants showing up for work?
Yeah, look, the solution has to be some type of legal work permit. This president has successfully secured the border. The border crossings are down by 99.5% since a year ago. We've been pushing for sensible reforms for the last 15 years. And the number one thing we always hear from members of Congress is that we got to have a secure border. So the president has succeeded in doing that. And now this next piece, like the president just said, is that there has to be a legal pathway for people who are, yes, undocumented, but they're working, they're paying taxes, they're law-abiding, to get them out of the shadows and receive a legal work permit is the solution. And I think that that is something that the majority of Americans support and care about, and we're excited to work with Congress and the administration to get done.
Well, Rebecca, let's build on that. What are the actual next steps here, and how realistic are they when we are looking at competing roles here between the White House and Congress? What actually needs to be taken next in terms of a tangible initiative or role going forward here?
Yeah, I think like the president just mentioned in your clip, that the employer can take the responsibility for employees, oftentimes that they've had for 10, 15, 20, 25 years. They're doing, the hard work of milking our cows or picking our crops. I know the president recently heard from dairy farmers. These are the mom and pop local farmers who may shutter their businesses just because of the aggressive ICE rates. And so this process would allow the employer to sponsor a legal work permit for their hardworking immigrant employees so that they can come out of the shadows, have a social security number, and legally work and continue to contribute.
All right, Rebecca, what are you going to be watching then? Is it the next court ruling or the next executive order from President Trump?
Oh, we're rolling up our sleeves and working with Congress and the president to get this done because, this issue has been broken for over 40 years. Both parties have kicked this down the road, and now we have a great opportunity, and we believe this administration can get it done.
Rebecca Shee from the American Business Immigration Coalition. We thank you for the insights, Rebecca. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Sarah McGregor now with more on the economic impact of these policies and what we've been learning here, Sarah, at Bloomberg News, the fear that's being instilled by these ICE raids. You're actually putting numbers on it. What are you learning?
Absolutely. So it's interesting. I'm sitting here in Los Angeles, and this is really, I think, where the conversation has kicked off. Workplace raids have really started, and LA was ground zero, as mentioned previously. There's troops on the ground, National Guard, Marines, and even in LA, we're seeing that impact that is happening right now. There's a lot of stories of folks who, are fearing they're not coming into work. Home Depots, day laborers have basically emptied out. Folks who sell fruit on the side of the road, and car washes. So you can see in a lot of ways that there's specific industries and jobs that are starting to really come under that pressure. At the same time, we've got fear. And so a lot of people were hearing at construction sites, for instance, LA needs to be rebuilt. The construction sites are empty. We were at a real estate conference last week where folks, including Rick Caruso, were talking about some of the fears there. So we're starting to see on certain levels some of these real economic impacts play out. And again, I think it's an interesting time because even a month ago when, just before the Trump administration really hit the gas on trying to, kick up these deportations again, we weren't seeing some of these raids or some of these fears. And I think now is where the rubber is starting to hit the road.
Well, Sarah, looking ahead here, our reporting indicates that Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins appears sympathetic, as we write in our article, to business concerns about labor shortages. What do we know about which advisors are advising President Trump on his deportation plans and how that has perhaps changed the rhetoric that we've heard out of this White House, where President Trump had suggested that there could be a reprieve when it comes to some of these industries?
There seems to be two camps, as you just mentioned. Brooke Rollins, the agriculture minister, having the ear of Trump, trying to convince him, of course, of the importance of ag to the economy. And Trump, we saw his first term. He's the one who gave billions of dollars of aid to farmers during his first trade war with China. He deemed them essential workers during COVID. So Trump himself has a firm understanding of the importance of agriculture to, of course, the economy, and also as big supporters to him politically. On the other side, we have immigration hardliners like Stephen Miller, who really just want to get the numbers out. They want Trump to hit this goal of 1 million deportations this year, which, they're not really anywhere close to at the moment. And so, on any given day, it's hard to tell who's sort of winning the ear of Trump on that. But again, we heard from Trump today, as we just talked about, saying, these reputable farmers should be able to kind of police who they have working on their fields, which, again, it raises more questions than answers. Is it an honor system, or are we creating a legal pathway to try and get more of these workers legal in the U.S.?
Enter J.D. Vance. Sarah, the vice president in Los Angeles. He just showed up. He's going to be making remarks at a pretty critical time here. Here's a live view on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube of the podium that awaits him in front of a rescue vehicle here. I'm guessing this won't make the affected people we're talking about feel much better, Sarah.
We'll all be interested in what, of course, he has to say. I would say on the ground right now, things have really, in terms of the protests, things have really sort of ebbed, especially since Saturday's No Kings Parade. We saw the curfew lifted in downtown LA. And if there are any protests now, they're extremely isolated or almost non-existent. At the same time, the workplace raids are really, at least anecdotally, more and more stories are being heard. And we've heard that up to 30 days of raids from about a week ago were supposed to sort of descend on LA. We've heard Trump say the inner cities are really where the problems are and they want to get the criminals. So we'll probably expect some of that messaging from J.D. Vance, of course, as he hits the podium. But we also heard Trump today take credit and say because the Marines, because the National Guards were in LA, that's why things are calmer. I think Karen Bass, the LAPD, would argue it was really the police on the front lines, of course, of those protests and their control tactics that sort of really interacted with the protesters. So I'll be interested to hear what the vice president has to say about the state of LA.
All right, Bloomberg's Sarah McGregor, we thank you so much.
Here's a look at some of the other stories that we're following at Bloomberg at this hour. Mahmoud Khalil must be released from prison after being held in Louisiana for more than 3 months, according to a federal judge who ordered the administration this afternoon to let Khalil out on bail. The Trump administration has been trying to deport the Columbia University graduate, despite being a permanent resident. The administration has justified holding Khalil over paperwork errors on his U.S. citizenship application and for spreading anti-Semitism, according to the State Department.
Plus, the Supreme Court has refused a request to fast-track a case challenging President Trump's sweeping tariff policy. The administration will now have the normal 30 days to file a full response to the lawsuit filed by two family-owned businesses looking to invalidate many of President Trump's levies. The legal standoff will be the first time the president's so-called Liberation Day tariff policy will be put before the justices.
And a federal judge issuing a new order that will allow Harvard University to continue enrolling foreign students while the school fights to overturn President Trump's proclamation barring their entry. After the order was announced, President Trump posting, quote, "We have been working closely with Harvard, and it is very possible that a deal will be announced over the next week or so." He writes they have acted extremely appropriately during these negotiations and appear to be committed to doing what is right, unquote.
Much more coming up, including the prospects for the president's tax bill and the latest as the White House weighs its next steps on the Iran-Israel conflict. We'll discuss ahead with our political panel. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio alongside Tyler Kendall. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for coming along. American firms that rely on Chinese magnets say an agreement announced by the Trump administration has yet to materialize. Bloomberg now reporting almost 10 days since President Donald Trump declared a done trade deal with Beijing. U.S. companies remain largely in the dark on when they'll receive crucial magnets from China and whether Washington in turn will allow a host of other exports to resume. Bloomberg's Mike Shepard has been all over this and joins us with the latest. Thought we had a deal. I thought we had a handshake. This was hammered out over the course of days.
Over the course of days and really weeks. Because remember, Joe, this conflict over rare earths and advanced technology exports from the U.S., the rare earths from China, the tech exports from here, it has been going back for months, really. And it was discussed initially during the first round of trade talks between the U.S. and China in Geneva. And when that started to go sideways, that little bit of détente began to unravel. They held another series of meetings in London to try to get things back on the beam and address those U.S. concerns about whether China would resume permitting sales of rare earths. And those are critical for the defense industry, for the auto industry, for the tech industry. And the longer that we see this delay in permitting from China, the harder it is for those companies to be able to maintain their supply chains, maintain their production of things like cars. And we haven't seen a real impact yet, but the risk is that we do. And these companies are going to have to start finding alternatives unless Washington resumes the pressure on Beijing here.
So, Mike, the crux of the London talks was the U.S. accusing Beijing of slow-walking these export licenses. But then there was some new reporting out today from the Wall Street Journal about potential U.S. action when it comes to our own license system. Can you walk us through this here? And should we expect some sort of escalation on the side of the U.S. Commerce Department?
It's a great question, Tyler, and this really is the other side of the coin in this whole rare earths versus tech tech exports battle, China has steadily been increasing its restrictions on exports of these critical minerals as the U.S. has been, in turn, tightening its own controls on exports of advanced technology to China. Washington's goal has been to rein in China's tech ambitions, especially in the area of artificial intelligence. But the restrictions in question that the Wall Street Journal was reporting on would apply to chip-making equipment used for less advanced semiconductors. Those are the kinds that are used in cars and in consumer electronics, and they're made mostly in China by non-Chinese firms, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, SK Hynix, and Samsung Electronics, both of Korea. And those companies really have a big stake in this because of their footprint in China, where they have access to big plants, a large workforce, and, permitting that allows them to build these factories and make these chips en masse for the world, including the U.S. market. So this is a critical thing that we'll be watching. There's no decision yet made, but this could emerge as a new irritant between the U.S. and China in this area of trade.
All right, Bloomberg's Mike Shepard, we thank you as always. A quiet day in Washington as the world's attention remains fixed on the war brewing between Israel and Iran, but a mad dash to get the president's tax bill passed is certain to bring a flurry of activity here to the nation's capital. Joining us now for more with their live reaction on Bloomberg TV and radio is this evening's political panel. Megan Hayes, former special assistant to President Biden and Democratic strategist, as well as Bloomberg politics contributor Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital, also a Republican strategist. Rick, I want to start with you as we hear from President Trump that this 2-week deadline, this is really the maximum that he's going to go towards. What do you take from the president's rhetoric as we've sort of seen a back and forth out of this White House about whether or not the U.S. will get involved in a strike on Iran?
Yeah, I think this is the unpredictability that is the Donald Trump presidency. We saw it a lot in the first term. We're seeing it now emerge. Some people call it the taco trade on Donald Trump. He talks tough and then backs down. Maybe we're seeing a little taco action this week. The reality is it really doesn't matter. There's only one pathway for Iran to avoid U.S. involvement, and that's by cutting a deal, and that means no enrichment. Republican hawks like Lindsey Graham have made it totally clear they will not support any deal with Iran that doesn't, stop enrichment of uranium for them. So Donald Trump has his hands tied a little bit in that regard. But that's what he would probably want too. And then the option is if they don't capitulate, total surrender, as Donald Trump says, then he may order a strike. Yesterday's presser where Donald Trump says he'd even consider a ceasefire. I mean, it's all over the map. And this is input he gets from Middle East leaders, leaders within his own party, the MAGA movement, his advisors. They're all telling him different things, and he's having trouble clearly sorting out where he wants to be on this.
There were questions as well, Megan. It's great to have you back about the intelligence that the president is seeing, whether the timing is in fact right here, and whether our intelligence matches up with that of Israel. He was asked about this today, about conflicting intelligence reports when it comes to Iran's nuclear ambitions, the progress that it's made. Take a listen.
Your intelligence community has said they have no evidence that they are at this point.
Well, then my intelligence community is wrong. Who in the intelligence community said that?
Your director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard.
She's wrong.
She's wrong, and that is not the first time that Donald Trump has said that. We should note that the White House made a clarifying point after that to say that Gabbard has backed Donald Trump's position on Iran uranium. Is the president standing on firm ground if he decides to strike?
I mean, who knows? He doesn't have a national security advisor. He doesn't have a national security council. He gutted most of it, and now he's saying he doesn't believe his director of national intelligence. I mean, these are people who should be in the room while he's making the decisions, and they're absent or he doesn't trust them. So who is he listening to? And if this has to go to Congress to vote on, what intelligence are they getting and what do they believe? Because it seems like they're all over the map. And frankly, I don't think Donald Trump knows if they have the capability for a nuclear weapon now or in 2 years. I don't think they actually know, because I don't think he trusts anyone around him, or he doesn't want to listen to the people that should know.
Well,
Oh, well, Rick, we're talking here about foreign policy, but I'd like to also transition to domestic policy, which is really taking front and center here in Washington. As we head into this weekend, there's going to be the bird bath. We're going to figure out what makes its way out of the Senate reconciliation process. But we were talking earlier on this program with Rohit, Kumar of PwC about how Medicaid is really going to be this politically fraught issue going forward, and that could be the sticking point on this bill. I'm wondering your take about how Republicans are going to thread the needle on this issue if, as he says, it could delay the bill.
Yeah, look, I mean, these Republicans from rural states like Susan Collins and Josh Hawley and Murkowski, I mean, like, they're not going to solve for this, right? They're going to oppose these deep cuts unless they find an avenue that they can create a bridge to making sure their constituencies don't go up in arms. I mean, this is the problem with having all these rural states turn red over the last decade. They expect their benefits, and they were getting them under Democratic rule, and they don't expect Republicans to take them away. So this could pose an incredibly difficult issue for those Republicans, especially like Susan Collins, who are up for re-election in the midterms.
It's going to be interesting if this actually gets to a vote next week. So we outlive the bird bath and we can stop wonking out on that. The fact is, Democrats will have a last stand in what I'm guessing is going to be an all-night vote-a-rama. Chuck Schumer's office has made clear there are 60 points of disagreement on this bill. What could Democrats get done?
I mean, I think that just as we've talked about a few times here, Democrats are really sticking to the Medicaid issue and to the SNAP benefits.
Can the effect change in the bill or just keep everybody up all night?
I think that, one, you can keep everyone up all night, right?
Yeah.
Like that, they love to do that in the Senate. But also, I think that you can get some Republicans to join your coalition, just like we were talking about some of these red state Republicans. They cannot afford to cut Medicaid at the expense of billionaires getting a tax cut. Like, that does not make sense logically to people who are getting those benefits cut. And I think that the Democrats have done an extremely good job in the last couple of weeks of messaging that, and that is what the American people believe. Recent polling shows that 75% or something outrageous do not agree with the way that they're handling this bill. They do not agree with the things in this bill. So the Republicans really are at an uphill battle here, messaging-wise, and getting this done definitely before the July 4th recess, but even getting some of the things done that the House voted in.
Is it realistic that Democrats could push back that July 4th deadline? Because at the end of the day, some version of this bill is going to pass, right?
I mean, I don't think that they are going to have the ultimate say, and when it gets done, I don't think that they have that kind of power, right? They don't hold the majority in any of this, but I do think that they can make it extremely hard for Republicans to take this vote, and they will make sure that it is very challenging for some of these Republicans, both in the Senate and when it comes back to the House, for them to take these votes, because their midterm elections and taking back the House for Democrats really depends on the success or the not success of this bill for them.
Rick, you must have a lot of memories coming back from your years in the Senate. Is this going to be working right up until the weekend, a working weekend next week? What can the leader, what can maybe more appropriately Donald Trump do to pressure senators to get it done in time?
Well, you know, I would say, first of all, shout out to Thune and his leadership. This is his first big test as majority leader. Nobody thought he could get this far this quick. The fact that we're actually talking seriously about this bill passing the Senate in a form that potentially the House could vote for before the 4th of July is unbelievable. It is a fantastic accomplishment. And from what we can tell, at least from the reporting, it hasn't required a lot of time from Donald Trump.
All right, our political panel tonight, Megan Hayes and Rick Davis, we thank you both.
Lot to figure out here over the course of the weekend. We'll be watching the bird bath, and we'll get back together next week to see where this legislation stands. In the meantime, check out the Washington Edition newsletter. You can find it on the terminal and online. Great to spend time again, Tyler. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you back here next week on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.